In part 0 of this series, I talked about the application that we're going to be creating, and I also put together some UML diagrams that demonstrate the infrastructure that I plan for this application to have. Now, if you didn't watch that part, no worries. Basically, the summary from that part is that we're going to be building a WPF MVVM coronavirus application that shows statistics about countries with coronavirus cases. And we're going to be displaying that data in a chart, and the goal is to display the countries with the top 10 amount of cases. And this is going to be great. So I'm going to have this application. I'm going to be able to track all the coronavirus country statistics. I won't have to watch the news anymore. I can just have this on my computer, and whenever I see the cases starting to go down, I'll be like, oh, I guess quarantine's over. I can go outside. So we planned all that out in the last part. There's some UML diagrams that I'm going to be showing from that part in just a little bit. But for now, let's get started and let's create our project. So we have a blank Visual Studio right here, no project, no solution. So let's go ahead and create that project. So new project, we're going to be doing a WPF.NET Core app. So let's select that, and I'm going to name this application the CoronaClient. And I'm going to have to change this path real quick. And there we go. So I'm going to put it in its own folder, of course. And we'll also just call the solution CoronaClient as well. I know a lot of people, including myself, like to split their solution into many projects, such as the domain layer, the UI layer. But for this is going to be a pretty simple application. So I'm just going to keep everything in one project. And if I need to split it into multiple projects in the future, we will do that refactoring. But I'm pretty confident we're just going to be keeping it simple. So let's go ahead and create. And there we go. We have our blank WPF application. Now the first thing I want to do is implement our domain layer for this application. And that is what I have implemented in the last part in our UML diagrams. So let me go ahead and bring those up real quick, and we'll do a little bit of a split screen and implement those classes and interfaces. So here is the UML that we implemented in the last part. Again, not very advanced, not a lot of content, but I had people asking about UML, so I figured I'd give them a small demonstration. So this pretty much makes up the domain layer for our application. So let's go ahead and implement this layer in our WPF project. So the first thing I want to do is create a new folder here, and we're going to call this models, and inside here it's going to hold all of the models of our domain layer. So really the only model we have is this coronavirus country. It's a model because it basically just holds data for us. It's going to hold all this data that represents a country with coronavirus. So let's go ahead and create a class for that. I'm just going to call it CoronavirusCountry, and we'll make it public and then implement all these properties. So the first property, of course, is just the country name. And then we're also going to have a property for the case count, so the amount of coronavirus cases in that country. And then lastly, I decided to have a property for flag URI. So this is just going to be a URI that points to an image of the country's flag, and I thought that would be useful to display somewhere on the chart on our WPF application. So that's actually all we need to do for our coronavirus country, and that's really the only model that I plan on having in this application at this time. So now let's go back and look at our domain layer. Another thing we need is this CoronavirusCountryService. So this is going to be a service class that will give us coronavirus country data. So it's going to make up our service layer. It's not going to be a model. So let's go ahead and create a new folder for this, and we're going to call it services. And let's create a new item here. This is going to be an interface, and it's just going to be our ICoronavirusCountryService. We'll make that public as well, and let's implement that method that we talked about. Now for this method, we're going to return a task of an IEnumerable of coronavirus countries. And I'll explain that return type in just a little bit. But let's import all that. And we're going to call this get top cases, of course, because it's going to give us back the top countries with coronavirus cases. And it's going to take in an int for the amount of countries that we want back. And that is all we need to do. So this return type, we're making this a task because we want to be able to use asynchronous programming. So we want to be able to await this task without blocking our UI when we make the call to get the top amount of cases. And then after we await that task, it'll give us back basically a list of coronavirus countries. And that's really all we have for our domain layer. So we can go ahead and close out of our Visio, go back to full screen, and now we're ready to actually implement this coronavirus country service. So to do that, we're going to be using an API, and I'll show you guys that API with Postman real quick. So let's create a new request. Let me grab the URL for the request, paste it in here, and let's send that request. So if we send the GET request to this URL, as you see, we get back a big old list of data for countries with coronavirus. So here we see China, the amount of cases, 81,000. And a cool thing you can also do is pass in sort parameters. So we can say sort, and then we can sort by cases. Let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, now we have the USA at the top with almost 100,000 cases, Italy right behind them. So the sort is working, so we're going to be using this API to get our data that we're going to display in our graph. So let's go ahead and head back to our project, and what I'm going to do in our services folder right here is create another folder for API. So basically in here it's going to have our implementation of this interface and all the other classes that that implementation needs. So let's create a new item here, and we're going to call this, first of all, it's going to be a class, and we're going to call it the API CoronavirusCountryService. So it implements this service by using the API. So let's implement that interface and make this class public. And as we recall, we made this a task, so we can make this method async, so when we call it, we don't block the UI. So now let's go ahead and actually implement this method. So the first thing we want to do is create an HTTP client. So let's specify that inside of this using statement, and we're putting it inside of a using statement so that when we finish up in this method, this HTTP client is automatically going to get cleaned up for us. So let's import that, and now we're going to use this HTTP client to make a request to that URI that we just showed in Postman. So let's specify that URI right here. We'll call this request URI, and it's going to be a string pointing to the URI. And let me just grab that endpoint real quick. There we go. So now that we have the URI, we're going to send a request using the HTTP client. So we're going to use client.getAsync, and then just pass in the request URI. And of course, this is an async method, so we're going to have to await it, and it also returns an HTTP response message. So let's get that message so we can read the data that comes back. Call this API response. And now that we have this message, we have to deserialize the content of the message to get the JSON. So let me bring up Postman. Basically, once we deserialize the content, we're going to get all of this inside of a string. Whoops. Let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to make a string. We'll call this JSON response, and we're going to await. We're going to use that API response, this HTTP response message. We're going to take a look at the content, and we're going to read it as a big fat string async, and it's going to give us back all that data. But we have this data, we need to get it into our model. We need to make it readable so that we can actually get coronavirus countries. And to do that, we're going to have to deserialize this string, and we're going to have to deserialize into actual objects. So those objects that we deserialize into are going to have to match the structure of this JSON. So right off the bat, our first object is going to have to be a list, as you can see by this bracket that denotes a list of objects, and then that list is going to have to be made up of an object that matches these properties. And then say we want to get the country info, which we actually will because we want to get this flag, then this country is going to need an object property inside of it for country info with these properties as well. Now we don't actually have to specify all of these properties, we only need to specify the properties that we need. So we only need country, we need cases, and then we need country info with just flag. So let me go ahead and move this over here for now, and let's create those objects that we need to deserialize into. So in this API folder, I'm just going to create a folder called models. Not to be confused with these models solely belong to the API. So the first thing I want is just like the root object. So that was the big old list of countries. So we'll call this coronavirus country listing. And I'm actually going to prefix all these with API so we don't get them confused with our models. These are the API models. So inside here, it's just going to be a simple class with one property, and that property is going to be the list of the coronavirus countries from the API, which we haven't made a model for, but we'll just call this countries. And let's go ahead and make that model. So we can actually do this. We'll call this API coronavirus country, and then control dot, and we'll generate that type in a new file. So now we can save that, and we should be done here. So we have this new coronavirus country from the API, and if we look at Postman, let me bring that up again, we're going to need a country property and a cases property, and also a country info property, which will be its own object. Let's go ahead and do that. So this string for the country, which will contain the country's name, and then we're going to need an integer for just cases, and then we're also going to need a country info. So this will be API country, called API coronavirus country info, and then we'll generate that class in a new file as well, and we need to name this country info. So that's an important thing. The naming does matter. We need to make sure these names all match the names on our object, so that when we deserialize, the deserializer knows what to do. So let's go to our country info, and all we need here is, I believe, that string for the flag. Let me just bring that up. Yep, just flag, and it'll give us back this resource URL right here that'll point to the image of the country's flag. So that should be everything we need to deserialize. So let's close out of all of these. I think all is good here. So now back on our API coronavirus country service, we're ready to actually deserialize our JSON into our API models. So the root model is going to be an API coronavirus country listing. Let's call this API country listing. And to deserialize this, we're going to be using a JsonSerializer. Let's go ahead and import that. Import our, I believe we spelled this wrong, did we? Oh, coronavirus, not corona. There we go. Alright, so we're going to use this JsonSerializer, and we're going to use deserialize. So inside these brackets, we can specify what we want to deserialize into, which is going to be this API coronavirus country listing. And then inside here, we just need to specify our JSON, which we have from our API. So there we go. And now we'll be able to use this API coronavirus country listing. So what this listing has is our list of countries. But now we have a problem because this is an API coronavirus country. We need our coronavirus country on our domain layer. So we need to map these countries to our domain countries. So to do that, we are just going to use our countries from the API, and we're going to use link, a select statement, to map these API countries to our domain layer. So inside the select statement, we specify a lambda. So it's going to take in each of the countries from our API, and that's going to be represented by this API country. And using that API country, we're going to return a new coronavirus country. In this coronavirus country, we're going to specify the properties that we want it to have. So let's start off with country name, which we can get from our API country. And as we recall, that was just named plain old country. That property from the JSON has the country's name. And then case count, we can use our API country again. And that has the cases in this property. And last but not least, the flag URI we have on our API country as well, inside the country info in the flag property. And there we go. So we're mapping each of our countries from our API into a coronavirus country. And then we're simply just going to return that, and that's pretty much it. So now we're ready to actually test this out. So let's head into our app.xaml.cs, and inside here we can specify an override function for one startup, and inside here we can write some code that'll run when our application starts up. So all that I'm going to do here is create our API CoronaVirusCountryService. Let's import that. We'll call it country service and just create a new instance. And now we're going to use that country service to get the top cases, and we didn't actually specify this parameter for the amount of countries to mean anything yet. We just want to test out our API, so let's just throw a 10 in there. And then we're going to have to make this an async void, which is okay in this case, and we'll await this. And then let's take a look at the results. So we'll just put that in a var for now, because we're just testing this out. And let's put a breakpoint here, and now we're ready to give this a shot. So let's run the application. And now we actually get an exception here. So there was an issue with our deserialization. So let's go ahead back in here, and let's just make sure that we're getting the right JSON back. So let's run this again. We have a breakpoint before we deserialize. So we get our JSON, and it looks good to me. So perhaps our JSON deserialization just simply is not working. Alright, so I did some research, and I should have known this, but if we take a look at our JSON, as we see, our root object is a list. Now that list doesn't have a property name. It is literally the root object. So that means we can't deserialize into this API coronavirus country listing because it's looking for a property named countries on the JSON that has a value of the list. But that's not the case. Our actual JSON is the list. So that means on our coronavirus country service, we need to deserialize into a list of coronavirus countries, or API coronavirus countries. So let's go ahead and change that. And we can call this API countries. And then we're just going to straight up use that list of API countries and map that into our coronavirus country on our domain layer. So this actually is a lot cleaner, and we can even delete this coronavirus country listing object. However, that is not the only issue we have. So, when we deserialize into this API coronavirus country, the property names are actually case sensitive. So let's look at our country, and as you can see, this is an uppercase C country, but on our JSON, it's a lowercase c country. So what we need to do is, on our service, when we deserialize, we can pass in an additional parameter for JsonSerializer options. Let's create one of those. And then on those options, we can specify that we want, I believe, property name case insensitive, and we want that to be true. And there we go. We should be able to look at these countries and get the right amount of data. So let's put a breakpoint there. And there we go. We don't get any exceptions. Let's look at our countries. And there we go. We get the amount of cases, the country name, and the flag URI as well. And now, let's get rid of that breakpoint, go to our app.xaml. If we continue, look at our result. Now we have our coronavirus countries. So we have our domain object. And one last thing before we wrap up, let's actually implement this amount of countries parameter. And to do that, we're just going to go into our coronavirus country service, and right after we get these API countries, we can specify a link method called take. So we're going to take the amount of countries, and basically what this is going to do is only take the first X amount of countries from this list of API countries. So if this is 10, it'll only give us back the first 10, and once we have those 10, then we will select them into our domain object. So this is a little bit inefficient, unfortunately, that we have to call the API and get all 200 countries back and then filter them after we get them in the objects. But unfortunately, this API doesn't allow us to put a limit on how many countries we want back. So this is what we are going to have to do in the meantime. Now that is actually all the code we're going to do for this part. And before we wrap up, let's actually create a Git repository. So I will git init right here. And then let's look at our source code. I actually want to create a gitignore file, vim.gitignore. And now inside here, we're going to specify what we don't want to include in the repository. So that's going to be .vs, so everything in that directory, bin, obj, and I'm thinking that's everything. So we can save that. Now we can add everything. Look at our git status, make sure we aren't adding any files that we don't want. So yeah, we ignored our bin file, our obj file, our .vs file, and now we pretty much just have our source code. So now we're ready to commit, and we're just going to call this add domain layer. And I'll have to add my username and email, so I'll do that off camera. But I'm also going to be posting the source code on GitHub, so be sure to check for the link in the description if you're interested in following along from GitHub. So that's going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, criticisms, or comments, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. But other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more, and stay safe out there.